The Earth's first swamps were more than stagnant wetlands. They were dynamic, living systems that shaped the evolution of life and created conditions for the rise of the planet's earliest superpredators. Thick mats of vegetation floated atop nutrient-rich waters, while dense networks of roots anchored sediments and redistributed chemical energy throughout the landscape. Beneath the surface, currents flowed invisibly, carrying gases, nutrients, and fine particles across an intricate lattice of microhabitats. Decomposition fueled nutrient cycles, sediments formed complex structures, and chemical gradients orchestrated interactions between water, vegetation, and microbial life. These swamps were not merely backdrops for evolution, they were engines of creation, forging resilient ecosystems that sustained life, sculpted the land, and set the stage for the apex predators that would dominate long before dinosaurs walked the earth. The swamp before predators. Before dominance took shape in flesh and bone, the swamp existed as a world unto itself, shaping the future through pressure rather than intent. These early swamps were not isolated wetlands scattered across continents, but immense, interconnected systems stretching across low-lying regions where land barely rose above water. Sea levels fluctuated slowly, drowning vast areas and retreating just enough to leave behind shallow basins that never truly dried. What emerged was not stable ground, but a living surface composed of water, sediment, and decaying plant matter, constantly rearranging itself under its own weight. The swamp was never finished forming. It was always becoming something else. The foundation of the swamp was instability. Soil, as it exists today, had not yet developed into firm, layered ground. Instead, sediments mixed freely with organic debris, creating a soft, compressible base that responded immediately to pressure and saturation. Plant matter accumulated faster than it could break down, stacking in thick layers that floated, sank, and shifted over time. Each layer carried the imprint of earlier conditions, but none were permanent. The swamp recorded its own history vertically, burying past surfaces beneath new growth while erasing clear boundaries between eras. Water ruled every interaction within this environment. It filled depressions, saturated sediments, and flowed slowly through hidden channels carved not by force, but by persistence. The distinction between land and water was largely cosmetic. Surfaces that appeared solid were often suspended above shallow pools, while deeper water hid beneath mats of vegetation thick enough to support temporary weight. The swamp did not offer certainty. It demanded constant negotiation with its fluid nature, reshaping itself in response to rainfall, groundwater seepage, and subtle changes in elevation. Light struggled to impose order on this world. Dense growth absorbed and scattered sunlight before it could reach lower levels, leaving much of the swamp floor in dim, filtered illumination. Shadows shifted constantly as vegetation moved with water and wind, creating the illusion of motion even in stillness. This low-light environment softened edges and obscured depth, making distance difficult to judge. The swamp resisted clarity, replacing it with proximity and immediacy. Nothing could be fully seen until it was already close. The air above the swamp reflected the same resistance to movement found below. Heavy with moisture and warmed by retained heat, it circulated poorly through dense plant layers. Gases released by decomposition accumulated near the surface, altering the composition of the atmosphere in subtle but persistent ways. Breathing conditions varied with height, time of day, and weather, creating invisible gradients that influenced endurance and comfort. The swamp extended its influence upward, ensuring that even the air behaved according to its rules. Decay was not an endpoint here, but a continuous process woven into the swamp's structure. Waterlogged conditions slowed decomposition just enough to preserve organic material while still allowing breakdown to occur. This balance trapped enormous quantities of carbon and nutrients within the system, storing energy that could be released repeatedly over time. Fallen vegetation became both foundation and fuel, supporting new growth while enriching the environment beneath it. The swamp fed itself through collapse. Sound and vibration traveled efficiently through this saturated world. Water, mud, and dense root networks transmitted movement far more effectively than dry ground. Even minor disturbances produced ripples that spread outward through multiple layers of the environment. The swamp was never silent. It pulsed with subtle signals generated by shifting sediments, flowing water, and structural collapse. These constant communications formed an underlying rhythm that defined the swamp's presence. Temperature within the swamp followed its own logic. Water moderated extremes, retaining warmth and releasing it slowly, while exposed surfaces reacted quickly to sunlight and shade. This created a mosaic of microclimates layered across small distances. Warm pockets, cool basins, and humid corridors coexisted side by side, each influencing chemical reactions and growth patterns differently. The swamp did not offer uniform conditions, only localized stability that could vanish without warning. Long before any creature could claim dominance, the swamp had already established the rules of survival. It rewarded persistence over speed, patience over force, and adaptation over resistance. Through saturation, darkness, and instability, it filtered possibilities relentlessly. The swamp did not need predators to be powerful. It was powerful on its own, shaping the trajectory of life simply by existing as it did, long before anything learned to rule within it. The chemistry beneath the waterline. Beneath the visible surface of the swamp existed a hidden world governed by chemical processes that unfolded slowly but relentlessly. Constant saturation prevented oxygen from penetrating deeply into the sediment, creating layers where traditional decay could not fully occur. In these oxygen-poor zones, different reactions took over, driven by microorganisms adapted to conditions that would suffocate most forms of life. The swamp became chemically stratified, with each layer operating under its own rules, shaping the environment from below long before anything moved across it. Plant matter accumulated in enormous quantities, collapsing into the water as fast as it grew. Leaves, trunks, and stems settled into the mud, where incomplete decomposition preserved their structure while transforming their composition. Carbon locked within this material remained trapped for long periods, compressed by the weight of new deposits. Over time, these layers formed vast organic reservoirs that influenced not only the swamp itself, but the chemistry of the surrounding landscape and atmosphere. Water within the swamp became a solvent for transformation. Acids released during decay altered pH levels, dissolving minerals from surrounding sediments and redistributing them throughout the wetland. Iron, sulfur, and other elements interacted with microbial activity, producing dark, fine-grained deposits that stained both water and soil. The swamp's murky appearance was a visible expression of chemical activity rather than simple depth or shadow. Microbial life thrived where larger organisms could not. Bacteria and fungi broke down complex plant compounds, releasing gases such as methane and carbon dioxide as byproducts. These gases accumulated beneath floating vegetation or within sediment pockets, occasionally escaping in sudden bursts that disturbed the water's surface. The swamp breathed through chemistry, exhaling decay in rhythms dictated by pressure and saturation. Chemical conditions varied sharply over short distances. A stagnant pool might become acidic and depleted of oxygen, while a nearby channel carried fresher water infused with minerals from deeper sources. These variations created invisible boundaries within the swamp, dividing it into zones defined not by geography, but by chemical state. Movement through the swamp meant crossing unseen thresholds that altered how matter behaved. Flooding intensified chemical exchange. Rising waters mixed layers that had remained separated for long periods, redistributing nutrients and gases across wide areas. When floodwaters receded, they left behind reorganized sediments and newly buried organic matter, resetting chemical gradients without erasing them entirely. Each flood added complexity rather than simplicity to the swamp's internal structure. Preservation within the swamp was selective. Bones, wood, and organic remains endured differently depending on where they settled within the chemical layers. Some materials were protected by anoxic conditions, while others dissolved rapidly. This uneven preservation shaped what traces of the swamp would survive into the future, determining how its history would be recorded and remembered. Nutrients circulated endlessly through this chemical system. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon moved from decay into water, into plant growth, and back into sediment again. The swamp became a closed-loop engine, retaining energy rather than allowing it to escape. Growth and collapse fed one another, sustaining productivity across immense spans of time. Through chemistry alone, the swamp exerted control. It dictated what could accumulate, what would dissolve, and what transformations were possible. Long before physical dominance emerged, chemical dominance ruled beneath the waterline, ensuring that the swamp remained a self-sustaining, ever-changing system capable of shaping life on a planetary scale. The illusion of solid ground. The swamp created the illusion of land, but solid ground was rare and fleeting. What appeared as stable terrain, matted plant debris, compressed sediment, and intertwined roots was often a temporary surface floating just above water or soft mud. Beneath this apparent stability lay hidden voids, pockets of saturated matter, and decomposing layers that could collapse without warning. The swamp blurred the boundary between land and water, teaching any observer that permanence was a fiction and that every step carried risk. Walking across it was less a matter of direction than of negotiation with instability, where balance and patience were rewarded far more than speed or force. Roots and vegetation were both support and trap. Dense networks of intertwined roots held floating mats together, creating temporary stability for plants, insects, and other life, while simultaneously concealing the fragility of the ground beneath. Some roots decayed unevenly, weakening patches of substrate, while others grew faster than surrounding plants, creating tension and pressure points. A single footfall could trigger a collapse that rippled outward, toppling trees and redistributing sediments in unpredictable ways. In the swamp, the ground had a memory, constantly shaped and reshaped by the weight of life itself. Water infiltrated these floating surfaces from below, seeping through root networks and saturating layers unevenly. This moisture created variations in density, so that a surface might support a heavy object in one area and give way in another. Pools and hollows formed beneath mats, hidden from view, making the swamp a three-dimensional puzzle of depth and buoyancy. The ground's behaviour changed constantly, sometimes holding its shape for years, sometimes collapsing in minutes, reinforcing the swamp's reputation for unpredictability. The swamp was in constant motion, even when appearing still. Slow subsidence, accumulation of decaying plant matter, and the gentle shift of mats over water created landscapes that were always moving, bending, or flexing. Small collapses fed larger ones, and over time entire patches of swamp could disassemble and reform in a new configuration. Familiar routes disappeared, channels shifted, and the surface itself was a dynamic entity rather than a static backdrop. It demanded adaptation and vigilance, from anything that traversed it. Seasonal changes magnified this instability. Floods lifted floating mats and redistributed sediments, while dry periods allowed layers to contract, crack, and sometimes harden temporarily. Temperature fluctuations caused expansion and contraction of waterlogged materials, subtly shifting the terrain over days and weeks. The swamp could erase its own topography, leaving only the vaguest impression of former shapes and structures. This perpetual reorganization meant that the land was never permanent, only temporarily borrowed. Weight distribution determined whether survival was possible in a given area. A slow, evenly applied load could traverse the swamp safely, while a sudden, concentrated step might break through layers of mud and detritus. The swamp's surface responded to forces unevenly, reinforcing lessons in patience and careful navigation. In such an environment, movement was strategic, deliberate, and guided by subtle cues in the ground itself, rather than any distant destination. The swamp's structure directly influenced water flow. Hollowed zones and compressed mats directed channels, redirected runoff, and shaped small-scale currents across the wetland. Sediments accumulated selectively, reinforcing certain pathways while leaving others shallow or unstable. Over time, this subtle re-engineering produced a labyrinthine network of microhabitats, invisible to anyone observing from above, where the land and water continuously redefined each other's boundaries. Even vegetation responded to the instability of the ground. Roots adjusted to shifting surfaces, stems and trunks leaned against more stable areas, and plants grew to reinforce surfaces that might otherwise collapse. In doing so, the swamp became self-reinforcing, maintaining some areas of temporary stability while constantly producing weak points elsewhere. The environment shaped its own architecture, dictating which areas endured and which succumbed to collapse. The swamp asserted its dominance through impermanence. It taught that nothing was fixed, that every layer, root, and mat was both structure and risk, and that survival depended on awareness of hidden instability. Solid ground was never guaranteed. It was only borrowed for as long as the swamp allowed. Through its shifting surfaces and deceptive strength, the swamp itself became the first and most enduring force on the landscape, shaping life long before anything could dominate it. The hidden flow of water. The swamp's waters were never truly still, despite appearances. Beneath a mirror-like surface, currents moved subtly, threading through shallow channels, drifting around submerged roots, and curling beneath mats of vegetation. These movements were not dramatic but persistent, shifting sediments, redistributing nutrients, and slowly reshaping the swamp from within. Even in the absence of storms or floods, water flowed imperceptibly, a hidden pulse that governed the structure and chemistry of the wetland. Its motion was deliberate and constant, a quiet force that reorganized landscapes over months, years, and centuries. Flooding cycles amplified these flows, creating temporary surges that redefined the swamp's topology. Seasonal rains raised water levels, lifting floating mats, redistributing debris, and scouring sediments in channels. Pools that had existed for decades could vanish in a single week, replaced by new hollows and redirected streams. When the floodwaters receded, they left behind a reassembled swamp, altered in ways invisible to the casual observer. Channels shifted, sediment patterns changed, and the balance between shallow and deep zones was remade, ensuring that no area remained static for long. Even the smallest water movement influenced chemical gradients. Dissolved minerals, gases, and organic compounds drifted with the flow, creating microenvironments within the swamp. Stagnant pockets became nutrient-rich or toxic, while slow-moving streams carried oxygen and trace elements to distant zones. This selective transport shaped the growth of plants, the decomposition of organic matter, and the formation of sediment layers, giving the swamp an internal structure that was both complex and dynamic. Water movement also controlled temperature distribution. Surface waters absorbed heat from sunlight, while deeper zones remained cooler and denser. As these layers interacted through convection, thermal currents subtly circulated heat throughout the wetland. Warmer pockets encouraged rapid chemical reactions and microbial activity, while cooler, stable areas slowed decay and preserved organic matter. The swamp was a living system of gradients, where energy flowed invisibly through liquid veins beneath a deceptive surface. Currents were constrained and guided by submerged vegetation and fallen logs. Roots, mats, and trunks redirected flow, creating mini-eddies, whirlpools, and slow pools. These structures were constantly changing as plant matter decayed or collapsed, ensuring that the water's path was never fully predictable. Sediments trapped by obstructions accumulated slowly, altering depth and redirecting future flows, making the swamp a self-modifying environment where water and structure were inseparable. Even minimal shifts in water could produce cascading effects. A slight tilt in a floating mat redirected currents, moving nutrients from one region to another and creating subtle differences in growth patterns across meters of wetland. The swamp acted as a hydraulic system where small perturbations multiplied over time, reshaping channels, exposing roots, and creating depressions that influenced vegetation and sediment deposition for decades. Every inch of water mattered, every drop part of a continuous feedback loop. The interaction between groundwater and surface water further complicated these flows. Springs and seepages introduced fresh, often mineral-rich water from below, creating local currents that ran counter to surface movements. These influxes produced chemical and thermal heterogeneity, supporting pockets of vegetation and microbial activity that differed from the surrounding swamp. By influencing local water flow, these hidden inputs also affected sediment deposition, creating microtopographies invisible to casual observation. Sediment suspension and deposition occurred continuously as water moved. Fine particles remained suspended for long periods, travelling across meters before settling, while heavier materials sank quickly. This selective transport produced uneven sediment layers, creating subtle ridges, hollows, and pockets that influenced subsequent water movement. Over time, the swamp became a layered mosaic, structured by flow patterns that were imperceptible to the eye, but critical to its function and persistence. The swamp's hidden flows were as vital to its identity as its waterlogged ground or dense vegetation. Currents dictated where nutrients concentrated, where decay progressed slowly or rapidly, and where new mats could form. Water shaped every process, from chemistry to sedimentation, quietly orchestrating the swamp's continuous transformation. It was a fluid architecture, invisible yet omnipresent, asserting control not through brute force, but through constant, patient motion that reshaped the world long before any creature could learn to dominate it. The weight of the air. The swamp's influence did not stop at the waterline. It extended upward, shaping the very air that hovered above its surfaces. Moisture hung thickly in every layer, trapped by dense plant canopies and slowed by stagnant conditions, creating a humid envelope that rarely dissipated. Breathing within the swamp was not simply a passive act, it was an interaction with the environment itself, where the composition of the air fluctuated subtly, yet persistently, depending on decomposition below, water levels, and seasonal shifts. The atmosphere carried the scent of decay, the weight of vapor, and a chemical richness that signaled the swamp's constant activity even to those who could not see it. Gas is produced by microbial and chemical processes accumulated in pockets above and within the water. Methane, carbon dioxide, and other trace compounds rose from sediments, collecting under mats of floating vegetation and within dense clusters of roots. These invisible layers, sometimes concentrated locally, altering oxygen availability for short periods and producing subtle shifts in temperature and density. The swamp's air was not uniform. It was stratified with invisible layers of composition and pressure that changed across meters, giving the landscape a complexity that extended well above the water's surface. Temperature fluctuations were moderated in unusual ways. Water stored heat from sunlight and released it slowly, while the thick, moisture-laden air acted as insulation. Even as external conditions shifted, the swamp retained its own thermal signature, with pockets of warm, dense air lingering over shallow pools and cooler, heavier air sinking into hollows. This created microclimates stacked upon one another, influencing evaporation, condensation, and chemical reactions in subtle ways that reinforced the swamp's internal logic and made it self-regulating. Mist and fog were constant companions, rising slowly from saturated surfaces and lingering in low-lying hollows. They softened distances, blurred boundaries, and created a sense of enclosure even in expansive wetlands. Visibility was never guaranteed, and every movement was measured against a backdrop of diffused light and shifting shadows. The swamp's atmosphere acted as a lens, filtering perception and imposing its own rhythm on anything that entered. It slowed awareness, enforced caution, and shaped experience itself. Air movement was patchy and unpredictable. Dense vegetation channeled breezes along narrow corridors, while leaving adjacent areas almost perfectly still. This uneven distribution reinforced stratification and allowed subtle temperature and gas gradients to persist, producing localized environments within the larger swamp system. These microclimates, in turn, affected plant growth, chemical processes, and the physical behavior of floating mats and sediments, ensuring that the swamp remained dynamic even above the water. Humidity interacted directly with chemical processes occurring at the swamp floor. Water vapor facilitated oxidation, supported microbial life, and transported dissolved nutrients upward where they could condense onto vegetation. Rain and condensation repeatedly recycled chemicals from the water to the air and back again, creating a continuous feedback loop that connected the swamp's chemical, hydrological, and atmospheric systems. The air was not separate from the swamp, it was an extension of it, shaped by the same forces that structured the ground below. The air also carried sound in unusual ways. High humidity dampened sharp noises while allowing lower frequencies to travel further, creating an acoustic environment that was muffled yet resonant. Vibrations transmitted through water, mud, and roots blended with subtle echoes in the air, making perception more local and immediate rather than distant and predictive. The swamp communicated as much through its atmosphere as it did through its sediments, moving and responding in patterns that were perceptible to those attuned to its rhythms. Even small weather events had magnified effects. A single heavy rain would add mass to floating mats, alter the density of air layers, and trigger localized currents both in water and air. Evaporation afterward returned moisture to the atmosphere, reinforcing existing stratifications. Wind, when it penetrated the canopy, had uneven impacts, bending vegetation, redirecting water, and subtly reshaping the swamp's microclimates. The swamp used every element, water, ground, and air, to maintain its self-regulating equilibrium. Through its atmosphere, the swamp asserted dominion far beyond the ground or water. The weight of air, laden with moisture, gas, and chemical compounds defined conditions for life long before any predator or plant fully mastered the landscape. The swamp imposed its rules invisibly, influencing respiration, temperature, sound, and chemical cycles. In this way, the swamp extended its reach upward, claiming even the space above as part of its persistent, shaping presence, a domain controlled not by force, but by the subtle, patient weight of its own existence. The rise and collapse of floating mats. One of the most remarkable features of the ancient swamp was the formation of floating mats, dense, interwoven layers of plant matter, roots, and sediment that rose slightly above the waterline, giving the illusion of firm ground while remaining perpetually unstable. These mats were born from accumulation, fallen leaves, decaying trunks, and decomposed vegetation gradually layered upon one another, bound together by living roots that acted as natural stitching. Over months and years, these mats thickened, creating temporary islands that could support small trees, shrubs, or other vegetation. Yet the very process that produced them also set the stage for eventual collapse, as each mat carried inherent instability within its layered structure. Floating mats were never uniform. Some areas were thick, heavy, and resilient, capable of supporting multiple layers of vegetation and waterlogged debris, while adjacent zones remained thin, fragile, and prone to sudden failure. The swamp's uneven deposition of organic matter, combined with variable water currents and sediment density, created a patchwork of stability and fragility. What appeared solid in one step could vanish beneath the next, collapsing silently into the water and leaving only turbulence and floating debris in its wake. This inconsistency forced the swamp itself to constantly reorganize, producing new mats to replace those lost to collapse. The mats functioned as both support and conveyor, transporting organic material, nutrients, and small sediments across the swamp. As water flowed beneath or between them, it carried dissolved minerals and gases that infiltrated the mats, feeding microbial processes and promoting further growth. In effect, the mats were living sponges, absorbing energy, cycling nutrients, and gradually increasing in thickness. Yet they were also dynamic structures. Water movement could lift, twist, or tear sections of the mat, creating microchannels and voids that influenced how and where the swamp would next accumulate matter. Collapse was an inherent part of the life cycle of floating mats. As new vegetation grew, roots added weight, compressing the layers below and increasing the risk of failure. Seasonal water level changes could lift sections and detach them from underlying sediment, while droughts or evaporation could shrink mats, crack them, and render them brittle. Even the decomposition of supporting roots over time destabilized the structure, ensuring that mats were never permanent. Each collapse released nutrients, reshaped local water flow, and created new opportunities for regeneration, feeding a cycle of creation and destruction that defined the swamp. The process of collapse was rarely uniform. Some mats tore slowly, folding in sections and leaving others intact, while others ruptured catastrophically, dumping entire layers of vegetation and debris into the water. Such events influenced both hydrology and chemistry, redirecting currents, creating temporary sediment dams, and mixing oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor water layers. These disturbances became essential to the swamp's self-maintaining nature, preventing stagnation and fostering continuous chemical, physical, and biological renewal. Floating mats also influenced microclimates above and below the water. By shading water beneath, they reduced evaporation locally, cooled submerged sediments, and created pockets of still, moist air. At the same time, decomposing matter within the mats released heat and gases, generating localized thermal and chemical gradients. These subtle shifts affected microbial activity, sediment deposition, and nutrient cycling, reinforcing the swamp's ability to maintain complexity and diversity across its constantly changing surface. The mats were crucial in connecting isolated parts of the swamp. Sections that would otherwise remain submerged became elevated, allowing water to flow around rather than over them. Channels carved beneath mats created hidden currents and small pools, while decomposed sections left depressions that filled with water and sediment. In this way, floating mats functioned as both bridges and barriers, simultaneously facilitating movement and controlling the internal architecture of the swamp, producing a labyrinthine environment shaped by collapse and regeneration. Over time, patterns emerged. Mats tended to form in regions of moderate current, where water movement allowed accumulation without tearing structures apart. Areas with excessive flow rarely maintained mats for long, while stagnant zones allowed them to thicken to extraordinary sizes. This balance between water dynamics, vegetation growth, and decomposition dictated the spatial distribution of mats across the swamp, effectively partitioning the environment into constantly shifting zones of relative stability and fragility. The floating mats were more than temporary surfaces. They were the very engines of the swamp's dynamic equilibrium. Their rise, thickening, and collapse dictated nutrient cycles, hydrology, and the physical shape of the environment. They taught lessons in impermanence and resilience, demonstrating how stability could exist only briefly and how collapse could simultaneously destroy and create. In this way, floating mats became the defining feature of the swamp, shaping its surface, internal structure, and ongoing evolution long before any predator would ever navigate its shifting plains. Sediment, decay, and nutrient cycling. The swamp was a master of recycling, transforming the relentless accumulation of organic matter into a continuously dynamic system of sediment and nutrients. Fallen vegetation, decomposing roots, and decayed plant matter did not simply vanish. Instead, they sank into the saturated layers below, forming dense, nutrient-rich sediments that could persist for decades or even centuries. Microbes and fungi worked tirelessly in these layers, breaking down complex compounds into simpler forms, releasing energy and chemical elements back into the water and soil. Every collapse of floating mats, every fallen tree, every decaying leaf contributed to a self-perpetuating cycle that fueled future growth and maintained the swamp's vitality. Sediment deposition was never uniform. Water currents, both visible and hidden beneath mats, redistributed fine particles over long distances, while heavier debris sank quickly, forming mounds and hollows that influenced water flow and plant establishment. Each layer of sediment told a story of previous events, seasonal floods, collapses, decomposition cycles recorded not in ink but in density, chemical composition, and texture. Over time, the swamp built vertical complexity, creating stratified beds of nutrients that allowed it to regenerate rapidly after localized destruction or environmental change. Decomposition within these sediments was a measured, controlled process. Waterlogged conditions slowed decay enough to preserve structural integrity, but microbial activity ensured that energy and nutrients were gradually released. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other critical elements cycled continuously through the swamp's layers, moving from organic matter to water to vegetation and back again. This cycle reinforced the swamp's resilience, allowing it to maintain productivity even in regions that seemed barren or stagnant. The interaction between sediment and decay produced chemical heterogeneity that shaped every aspect of the swamp. Pockets of oxygen-poor mud allowed anaerobic reactions to dominate, generating methane and other gases that rose slowly through water and vegetation. Simultaneously, aerobic zones near the surface supported rapid microbial breakdown, releasing nutrients that encouraged rapid plant growth. The swamp functioned as a mosaic of chemical environments, each zone influencing the layers above and below, creating a complexity that no single organism could fully master. Nutrient distribution was guided by water flow and collapse events. As currents moved dissolved compounds and fine sediments, they concentrated essential elements in certain regions while depleting others. When mats or debris collapsed, buried nutrients were exposed or redistributed, providing bursts of fertility that supported new growth. The swamp maintained itself through this uneven cycling, producing spatial variability that encouraged diversity in plant structure, density, and chemical composition. Organic matter that sank into sediments also influenced the physical structure of the swamp floor. Thick layers of decomposing material compressed over time, stabilizing some areas while leaving others soft, waterlogged, or prone to sudden collapse. These gradients of firmness shaped water flow, dictated the distribution of floating mats, and created microhabitats for microbial communities. The swamp's sediment was simultaneously substrate, nutrient reservoir, and structural framework, integrating chemical, physical, and biological processes into a single living system. Even gases produced during decay contributed to the swamp's dynamics. Methane and carbon dioxide accumulated under mats or within sediment pockets, slowly releasing to the atmosphere or dissolving into water. These invisible movements altered buoyancy, water chemistry, and even local temperature gradients, subtly affecting the formation of mats, the growth of plants, and the redistribution of sediments. The swamp cycles were not merely horizontal or vertical, they extended into the chemical and gaseous dimensions, linking all layers into a coherent, self-regulating system. Flood events amplified the role of sediment and nutrient cycling. Rising waters scoured sediments from channels, redistributed nutrient-rich material across previously dry areas, and submerged new zones for decomposition and deposition. When floodwaters receded, they left behind transformed landscapes with newly enriched sediments, altered water flow, and reorganized mat formations. Each flood reset portions of the swamp without erasing its overall structure, reinforcing the feedback loop that made the swamp both resilient and perpetually mutable. The continuous interaction of sediment, decay, and nutrient cycling defined the swamp's very identity. It was a system in which destruction fueled creation, collapse promoted stability, and decomposition drove regeneration. The swamp's processes were self-contained, yet intricately connected, shaping physical terrain, chemical composition, and biological potential long before any predator, herbivore, or explorer would ever step onto its deceptively solid surfaces. It was a world alive in itself, a dynamic engine of Earth's earliest ecological architecture. Hidden currents and microhabitats. Beneath the seemingly uniform surface of the swamp, a network of hidden currents shaped the very life and structure of the wetland, carving paths invisible to the casual observer. Water did not flow in simple, predictable lines. Instead, it moved in subtle, complex patterns, guided by submerged roots, floating mats, and uneven sediment layers. These microcurrents redistributed nutrients, dissolved gases, and fine sediments across the swamp, creating pockets of fertility and zones of stagnation that varied across mere meters. Each current influenced the chemical and physical properties of its immediate surroundings, shaping where plants could thrive, where decomposition accelerated, and where mats could form or collapse. The swamp was, in essence, an organism with its own circulation system. These hidden flows created microhabitats that were both fragile and resilient, often coexisting side by side. Shallow, slow-moving pockets of water accumulated decayed organic matter, forming nutrient-rich zones that supported dense vegetation and encouraged microbial activity. Adjacent areas with slightly stronger currents flushed away detritus, preventing accumulation and creating open channels that facilitated water movement while limiting plant growth. This intricate patchwork allowed the swamp to maintain high ecological complexity, producing a dynamic interplay of stability and change within a single, contiguous ecosystem. Water movement beneath mats was particularly influential. Floating layers of vegetation created partial barriers, slowing currents in some areas while channeling flow through small gaps in others. These subtle differences in flow led to selective deposition of sediments, the formation of hollows and ridges, and localized variations in water chemistry. By directing the movement of nutrients, gases, and dissolved minerals, these hidden currents acted as the swamp's internal engineers, continuously reshaping the terrain without ever being visible from the surface. Even minor disturbances could trigger significant change. A single floating mat, lifted or torn by current, could redirect flow, sending dissolved compounds and sediments in new directions. This, in turn, affected microbial activity, plant establishment, and sediment deposition downstream. The swamp functioned as a feedback system, where small perturbations multiplied over time, producing large-scale effects on both surface structure and submerged habitats. Stability in the swamp was therefore temporary, constantly negotiated between flow, sediment, and vegetation. Temperature and chemical gradients within these currents further enhanced microhabitat diversity. Water flowing beneath mats often retained slightly more warmth, supporting accelerated microbial metabolism, while shaded, stagnant pockets remained cooler and chemically distinct. Variations in oxygen concentration, pH, and dissolved minerals emerged in these microenvironments, producing localized niches where specific biochemical processes could dominate. These gradients were invisible to the eye, yet crucial to the swamp's internal organization, dictating where organic matter decomposed, where nutrients concentrated, and where vegetation could colonize new surfaces. The interplay between currents and sediment deposition created subtle topographical diversity. As fine sediments settled in low-energy zones and heavier particles sank quickly, small ridges, depressions, and mini-channels formed, shaping the next generation of mats and vegetation. Floating mats reinforced some areas while leaving others vulnerable, producing an ever-shifting landscape that responded directly to water movement. Over time, the swamp became a living mosaic, its structure dictated by a combination of currents, sedimentation, and the weight of decomposing material. These hidden flows also influenced gas exchange. Methane and carbon dioxide generated in anaerobic pockets slowly diffused upward along microcurrents, occasionally concentrating beneath mats or in stagnant pools. Oxygenated water moving through channels replenished local aerobic zones, sustaining microbial activity and supporting partial decomposition in areas that would otherwise stagnate. The swamp was a continuous chemical engine, with currents serving as its circulatory system, connecting isolated zones and regulating life and decay throughout. Even the smallest plants or debris could alter microhabitats by slightly redirecting water movement. Fallen leaves, decaying twigs, or minor root growths created eddies, sheltered zones, or nutrient traps. Over time, these minute interactions produced cumulative effects that shaped mat formation, sediment distribution, and chemical cycling across the wetland. The swamp demonstrated that complexity emerged not only from large-scale structures, but also from countless tiny interactions occurring simultaneously, all orchestrated by hidden currents. The swamp's hidden flows and microhabitats reinforced its identity as a self-regulating, dynamic system. Water movement dictated the internal architecture of sediments, the formation of mats, the distribution of nutrients, and the chemistry of air and water alike. Nothing in the swamp existed in isolation. Every current influenced another. Every microhabitat affected its neighbours. Long before any predator or explorer entered this world, the swamp had already mastered its own balance, maintaining a delicate equilibrium of flow, accumulation, and decay that ensured its endurance through millennia of subtle change. The cycles of rise and fall. The swamp lived and breathed through cycles of rise and fall, an endless rhythm that shaped every layer, mat, and channel within its domain. Water levels were rarely constant, influenced by rainfall, seasonal floods, groundwater input, and subtle shifts in topography. When waters rose, previously exposed mats lifted, sediments shifted, and nutrient-rich debris was carried into new zones. This inundation submerged plants, accelerated decomposition, and rearranged microhabitats, allowing the swamp to renew itself on both chemical and physical levels. Rising water was not merely a force of erosion, it was a mechanism of reorganization, a conveyor that redistributed life, matter, and energy throughout the wetland. The fall of water was equally transformative. As floods receded, mats settled unevenly, exposing sediments to air, altering oxygen gradients, and creating patches of chemical heterogeneity. Nutrients buried for months or years became accessible again, fueling sudden bursts of microbial and plant growth. Shallow basins formed where mats sank, concentrating water and nutrients into isolated pools. In this way, receding water was never an end, but a transition, producing new surfaces, new channels, and new opportunities for growth and decay. Each cycle left behind a landscape that was familiar yet subtly different, a constantly rewritten map of rise, fall, and renewal. The interaction between water, sediment, and vegetation during these cycles created a layered complexity unmatched in terrestrial ecosystems. Floating mats responded to rising water by expanding, bending, and sometimes fracturing, while submerged roots redistributed sediment and trapped nutrients. The collapse of one section fed the growth of another, as decomposed material nourished new mats or strengthened existing ones. These interconnected dynamics ensured that the swamp remained productive, resilient, and adaptive, even under the stress of dramatic environmental shifts. Floodwaters often created temporary channels that would vanish after receding, reshaping the swamp's internal flow patterns. Water scoured softer sediments while depositing fine particles in low-energy zones, producing ridges, depressions, and subtle barriers that would guide the next cycle of rise and fall. These transient channels were microarchitectures of the swamp, directing the movement of nutrients, gases, and debris long after the floodwaters had disappeared. Each rise and fall created an invisible blueprint that guided the swamp's ongoing evolution, one cycle layered atop the previous. Decomposition intensified during these cycles. Submerged vegetation decayed more rapidly under the added pressure and saturation of floodwaters, releasing gases and nutrients that altered local chemistry. As waters receded, previously oxygen-poor sediments were exposed, enabling aerobic microbial activity and further transformation. This cyclical acceleration and deceleration of decomposition allowed the swamp to retain nutrients efficiently, sustaining long-term productivity in a system that appeared chaotic but was tightly self-regulated. The physical collapse of mats during these cycles produced sudden but predictable changes in microtopography. Sections that sank or tore apart created new depressions and elevated zones, modifying both water movement and sediment deposition. These structural shifts affected subsequent mat formation, dictating where floating layers could stabilize and where instability would prevail. The swamp orchestrated its own renewal through these collapses, using destruction as a tool to foster creation, turning the seemingly chaotic interplay of rise and fall into a precise mechanism for environmental balance. Even small-scale events played a role in these cycles. Minor flooding, local mat collapse, or the gradual subsidence of a nutrient-rich zone could cascade through adjacent areas, altering currents, sediment distribution, and plant growth. The swamp's response was proportional yet non-linear. Tiny disturbances could amplify into large-scale transformations over weeks or months. This sensitivity ensured that the swamp was never static, constantly adjusting to maintain equilibrium between accumulation and erosion, saturation and exposure. These cycles also reinforced chemical gradients. Flooding redistributed dissolved gases, minerals, and nutrients, while drying exposed sediments and encouraged localized oxidation. The interplay of rise and fall maintained zones of variation in oxygen, pH, and chemical composition, producing a heterogeneity that supported diverse microbial processes. The swamp's productivity was sustained not by uniformity, but by continual fluctuation, where change itself became the key to stability and longevity. The cycles of rise and fall were the heartbeat of the swamp. Every mat that rose or sank, every sediment layer displaced, every pulse of water or air movement contributed to a system of renewal and resilience. These rhythms shaped the physical and chemical structure of the swamp, orchestrated nutrient flows, and established microhabitats, all without any external management. Long before creatures navigated its deceptive surfaces or sought to exploit its resources, the swamp had mastered the art of self-organization, surviving and thriving through patterns of rise, collapse, and rebirth that ensured its persistence over millennia. Shadows and light in the wetlands. Light in the swamp was a scarce and shifting resource, filtered through layers of dense vegetation, thick canopies, and floating mats that hung like curtains above the water. Sunlight penetrated unevenly, creating pools of illumination that shifted with the movement of leaves, mats, and stems. These patches of light dictated growth patterns as plants competed for access, stretching toward openings while avoiding areas where shadow dominated. The interplay between light and darkness was not merely aesthetic, it shaped every biological and chemical process within the swamp, producing gradients that defined microhabitats and the distribution of nutrients, oxygen, and moisture. Shadows themselves became dynamic forces, moving slowly as floating mats shifted, water levels changed, or branches swayed in faint currents. Areas in shadow were cooler and moister, slowing evaporation and altering the rate of chemical reactions in sediments. Microbial activity in these zones differed from sunlit areas, producing pockets where decomposition slowed and organic matter accumulated more efficiently. Sunlight, conversely, accelerated chemical reactions, warmed surface water, and encouraged rapid growth in exposed plants, creating a patchwork of energetic variation across the swamp. The constant fluctuation of light and shadow made the swamp a spatially and temporally complex ecosystem, where microclimates evolved continuously. Floating mats affected the penetration of sunlight as well. Thick mats blocked light entirely beneath them, creating underwater zones of near total darkness, where chemical processes and microbial activity diverged dramatically from surrounding areas. These shaded microzones became repositories for decomposed organic matter, sediments, and gases, altering water chemistry locally. Meanwhile, edges of mats allowed partial light to seep through, producing gradients that favoured certain plant and microbial species while discouraging others. Light itself was sculpted by the swamp's architecture, turning energy into a tool for environmental structuring. Even subtle differences in angle or density of vegetation could produce measurable effects. A slight shift in a mat, a fallen branch, or a bending stem could redirect beams of sunlight, illuminating small patches of water and sediment. These minute changes influence plant colonization, sediment heating, and chemical gradients in ways that accumulated over time. The swamp operated on scales both large and small, and light was one of the primary agents connecting these layers, affecting processes from the microscopic to the landscape level. Shadows also affected evaporation and water temperature. Areas in shade retained moisture longer, slowed cooling and heating cycles, and moderated temperature fluctuations in shallow pools. Sunlit areas experienced faster evaporation, warmer water, and accelerated chemical reactions, producing local variations in oxygen and nutrient concentrations. These thermal and chemical microgradients guided the placement of mats, dictated microbial efficiency, and reinforced the swamp's structural and functional diversity. The interaction of light and water created reflective patterns that further influenced the swamp. Sunlight glinting off the water surface illuminated areas beneath floating vegetation sporadically, producing irregular bursts of energy that fueled localized chemical reactions. Water absorbed and redistributed light in subtle ways, warming sediments selectively and affecting microbial decomposition. The swamp was thus not a static environment but a continuously responsive system where even sunlight became an instrument for shaping chemical, physical, and biological processes. Shadows also influenced the distribution and structure of mats themselves. Plants growing toward light created tension on mats, bending and twisting roots and stems in response to sun exposure. This movement altered buoyancy, compression, and cohesion within floating mats, subtly influencing where collapse might occur. The very pursuit of sunlight drove physical restructuring of the swamp's surfaces, linking energy capture with mechanical stability in a continuous feedback loop. Even minor variations in cloud cover or wind could amplify these effects. Passing clouds dimmed light intermittently, producing sudden shifts in temperature and evaporation rates. A gentle breeze might sway vegetation, allowing light to penetrate previously shaded zones. These temporary changes triggered pulses in chemical reactions, microbial activity, and plant growth, creating short-lived but cumulatively significant fluctuations in the swamp's microenvironments. The swamp's response to light was immediate, localized, and yet connected to broader environmental patterns, revealing its intricate integration of physical and chemical processes. Light and shadow in the swamp were more than environmental factors. They were structural forces that shaped the entire wetland. Sunlight dictated energy distribution, influenced water and sediment chemistry, guided plant growth, and interacted dynamically with floating mats, currents, and decomposition. Shadow moderated all of these processes, creating gradients, preserving moisture, and stabilizing chemical reactions. Together, light and shadow orchestrated a complex spatial and temporal pattern that defined microclimates, guided nutrient cycling, and reinforced the swamp's identity as a living, adaptive system. that existed long before any predator or external force learned to navigate its deceptive surfaces. The flow of life through the swamp. Life in the swamp, though unseen by most, moved and shifted with the currents of water, sediment, and decaying vegetation, forming a dynamic network that pulsed continuously beneath and upon the surface. Water served as the primary conveyor, carrying dissolved nutrients, gases, and fine sediments from one part of the wetland to another, ensuring that no area remained chemically or physically isolated for long. Flow was rarely uniform. It meandered through hidden channels, swirled beneath mats, and percolated through layers of soft sediment, producing localized variations in chemical composition, temperature, and oxygen availability. These variations created zones of intense productivity adjacent to regions of relative stagnation, establishing a rhythmic circulation that defined the swamp as a system of interconnected microenvironments. Floating mats were critical highways and platforms within this flow of life. As mats shifted, thickened, or collapsed, they transported accumulated organic matter, nutrients, and gases across the wetland. Decomposed plant material trapped within mats was gradually released into surrounding water as fibers and particles broke down, feeding microbial communities and supporting plant colonization elsewhere. These mats were both stabilizers and distributors, controlling the dispersal of life-sustaining compounds while simultaneously shaping the physical landscape. In effect, mats functioned as mobile nodes in a constantly evolving network, connecting zones of fertility, decay, and regeneration. Sediments beneath mats and in shallow pools responded directly to these flows. Fine particles remained suspended for long periods, traveling with currents before settling in calmer areas, while heavier materials sank quickly, forming ridges, depressions, and undulations that influenced future water movement. These sediment patterns dictated where mats could establish or collapse, creating feedback loops between flow, accumulation, and stability. The swamp's physical landscape was inseparable from its chemical and biological dynamics. The movement of matter dictated where life could persist and how the ecosystem would reorganize after disturbances. Decomposition intertwined with water flow to sustain nutrient cycling. As organic matter sank into sediments or remained trapped within mats, microbes gradually released nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and other essential elements. Water carried these nutrients to nearby zones, often over significant distances, enriching sediments and promoting plant growth in new areas. The swamp functioned as a self-contained nutrient economy, where waste became capital, decomposition was investment, and flow redistributed energy to ensure long-term resilience. Even slight changes in water levels amplified these dynamics. Rising water lifted mats, connecting previously isolated pools and spreading nutrients across broader zones, while receding water concentrated sediments and organic matter in hollows. These fluctuations reshaped local currents, altered chemical gradients, and shifted microhabitats. Each pulse of water represented both a challenge and an opportunity, a natural mechanism for regulating nutrient distribution, maintaining diversity, and fostering resilience across the wetland. The vertical dimension of water flow added further complexity. Thermal and chemical stratification meant that currents at different depths behaved differently. Denser, cooler water flowed beneath warmer surface layers, mixing oxygen-poor and oxygen-rich zones, while decomposed matter released gases that slowly rose, influencing buoyancy and chemical equilibria. The swamp existed in 3 dimensions, with movement occurring horizontally, vertically, and through the subtle interaction of water and suspended matter. Life responded accordingly, occupying niches determined as much by depth and circulation as by surface stability. Interactions between mats, sediments, and currents also created microhabitats of extraordinary diversity. Hollow depressions beneath mats collected water and fine sediments, producing nutrient-rich, oxygen-variable pools that supported concentrated microbial activity. Elevated ridges and denser mats created drier, shaded zones where decomposition proceeded more slowly and chemical gradients were stabilized. The swamp was thus a mosaic of conditions, constantly shifting yet maintaining internal balance, where the flow of water mediated both destruction and creation in a continuous cycle. Even imperceptible events contributed to this network. A mat subtly shifting in response to water flow could redirect currents, altering the deposition of sediments and nutrients downstream. Gas release from decomposing sediment could influence buoyancy, chemical composition, and microbial activity across meters. Minor collapses or expansions propagated through the swamp, producing cumulative changes that affected the structure and productivity of the ecosystem at scales far beyond their initial impact. The swamp's internal circulation was sensitive, adaptive, and self-organized, a system in which even small movements mattered. The flow of life through the swamp was not random but patterned, governed by hydrology, sedimentation, decomposition, and vegetation structure. Currents carried nutrients, gases, and energy through a network that linked every mat, pool, and sediment layer, while floating mats distributed matter and stabilized structure. Together, these processes produced a dynamic equilibrium, maintaining diversity, productivity, and resilience long before any predator entered its domain. The swamp existed as a living, breathing system, with flow as its circulatory heartbeat, perpetually orchestrating the rise, collapse, and renewal of life within its waters. The sediment web. Beneath the surface of the swamp, a hidden network of sediments formed a complex web that dictated both structure and function within the wetland. Each particle of sand, silt, clay, or decayed plant matter contributed to an intricate lattice of support, storage, and chemical processing. Sediments were not passive, they were living repositories, continuously reshaped by water currents, decomposing vegetation, and the weight of floating mats. Layers built over time, with older deposits compressed beneath new ones, forming a vertical hierarchy of materials that recorded the history of floods, collapses, and nutrient flows. The sediment web was both archive and engine, preserving the past while driving the swamp's ongoing dynamics. Fine sediment suspended in water travelled great distances before settling, while heavier particles sank quickly, creating subtle variations in topography that guided future water movement and mat formation. These deposits dictated which areas could support vegetation and which would remain soft, waterlogged, or prone to sudden collapse. The sediment web was thus a physical map of opportunity and limitation, with every ridge, hollow, and depression influencing how water flowed, how mats stabilized, and where nutrients concentrated. Each layer of sediment reinforced or destabilized the swamp's surface, producing a constantly shifting interplay between ground and water. Organic material within sediments fueled microbial life, which in turn transformed chemical properties and nutrient availability. Layers rich in decayed plant matter were hotbeds of activity, producing gases such as methane and carbon dioxide that slowly percolated through sediments and water, altering buoyancy and chemical equilibria. Aerobic microbes consumed oxygen near the surface, while anaerobic organisms dominated in deeper layers, producing localized pockets of chemical variation. The sediment web was a three-dimensional laboratory where decomposition, nutrient cycling, and chemical reactions intersected to maintain productivity across the swamp. The deposition of sediments was influenced by the rise and fall of water, as flood events redistributed fine particles and organic debris over vast areas. When waters receded, previously submerged sediments were exposed to oxygen and sunlight, accelerating decomposition in some zones while stabilizing others. Small-scale shifts, such as the collapse of a mat or the redirection of a channel, could amplify sediment redistribution, creating new microtopographies and nutrient-rich hollows. These processes were continuous, ensuring that no sediment layer remained static and that the web of particles beneath the swamp remained dynamic and self-renewing. Even the slightest changes in vegetation impacted sediment dynamics. Roots stabilized some deposits while leaving adjacent areas vulnerable, guiding water flow and influencing where fine particles settled. Falling leaves and decaying plant matter contributed to sediment thickening, while decomposing mats released trapped materials back into circulation. The swamp's sediment web was a system of feedback loops where physical structures and biological processes were inseparable, continuously influencing each other to produce a living, self-organizing landscape. Sediments also controlled chemical gradients within the swamp. Layers rich in organic matter absorbed and retained nutrients, creating zones of fertility, while dense mineral deposits slowed water infiltration, producing localized pockets of stagnation. These chemical variations dictated microbial activity, plant colonization, and even the buoyancy of floating mats. The sediment web acted as both foundation and filter, structuring the environment while simultaneously regulating the flow of energy, nutrients, and gases throughout the wetland. Gas accumulation within sediments added yet another layer of complexity. Methane and carbon dioxide released by microbial activity slowly rose through pore spaces, influencing buoyancy and the decomposition rates of overlying layers. Sudden releases could disturb the balance of mats and water, redistributing sediments and nutrients in small but meaningful ways. This constant movement of gas, coupled with water and sediment dynamics, created a living lattice of energy, chemical activity, and structural transformation, where even invisible elements exerted influence over the swamp's architecture. Sediment interactions also shaped microhabitats by creating subtle variations in elevation, water depth, and substrate firmness. Shallow ridges became refuges for vegetation and mats, while depressions collected water, organic matter, and decomposing material. These variations defined microclimates, influenced chemical gradients, and structured the flow of water and nutrients. The swamp's sediment web was therefore both a foundation and a blueprint, determining where life could thrive, where decay would dominate, and how the swamp would evolve over time. The sediment web was the unseen skeleton of the swamp, a three-dimensional structure that linked water, vegetation, decay, and chemical processes into a cohesive whole. It dictated the distribution of nutrients, the formation of floating mats, the movement of currents, and the dynamics of decomposition. Every particle mattered, every layer shaped the next, and every interaction reinforced the swamp's identity as a self-regulating, dynamic ecosystem. Long before predators or external forces interacted with it, the sediment web maintained the swamp's vitality, resilience, and adaptability, ensuring its survival and continual renewal through millennia of subtle transformation. The hidden strength of roots. Roots were the invisible scaffolding of the swamp, threading through sediments, floating mats, and waterlogged soil to create stability in an otherwise fragile environment. These subterranean networks bound plant matter together, holding mats in place, trapping sediments, and reinforcing surfaces that might otherwise collapse under their own weight. Roots were both flexible and resilient, capable of bending with rising water, stretching across hollows, and anchoring into softer layers of decomposing material. Their presence transformed instability into temporary solidity, allowing plants to thrive in an environment that constantly challenged every surface, every particle, and every organism that relied upon it. Floating mats owed much of their cohesion to root systems. Interwoven fibers acted like natural stitching, distributing weight evenly across the surface and allowing mats to support heavier vegetation than would otherwise be possible. When mats lifted or shifted with changes in water level, roots absorbed stress, bending without breaking and redistributing pressure across neighbouring areas. In this way, mats could expand, merge, or partially collapse without fully destabilizing, maintaining a dynamic equilibrium between buoyancy, weight, and support. Roots were the hidden architects of these floating islands, ensuring that the swamp could maintain continuity despite its constant cycles of rise, fall, and decay. Roots also anchored vegetation in sediments below, connecting surface mats to the deeper layers that stored nutrients, water, and chemical energy. Penetrating the mud, they created channels for water movement, facilitated the cycling of nutrients from sediment to plant, and reinforced soil structure to resist collapse. Even the densest or softest sediments became integrated into the swamp's living framework through these root networks. The depth, density, and direction of root growth influenced not only physical stability, but also the chemical and microbial composition of sediments, reinforcing the swamp's capacity for regeneration and resilience. The strength of roots was magnified by redundancy. Numerous individual roots spread across the same zone, creating a web of overlapping support. If one root decayed or broke, neighbouring fibres compensated, preventing sudden failures in mats or sediment layers. This redundancy also allowed mats and vegetation to grow unpredictably, expand into new zones, and adapt to subtle shifts in water flow or sediment deposition. Roots functioned as both stabilizers and buffers, absorbing shocks and mediating the swamp's response to environmental fluctuations. Roots influenced water movement and the formation of currents. Submerged fibers slowed flow, trapping sediments, nutrients, and decomposed material in specific zones. Dense root mats beneath floating vegetation created pockets of still water, allowing chemical gradients to develop, gases to accumulate, and microbial communities to flourish. Conversely, gaps in root networks directed water along preferred channels, eroding sediments selectively and redistributing nutrients to new areas. Roots acted as hydraulic engineers, shaping both surface and subsurface flow while simultaneously maintaining physical cohesion. Even decomposition interacted dynamically with roots. While older or decayed roots weakened in structure, they continued to influence sediment cohesion and water retention. Microbial activity around decaying roots released nutrients into the surrounding sediment and water, creating concentrated pockets of fertility. Young roots often colonized these decayed zones, reinforcing mats and sediment while taking advantage of enriched conditions. The swamp relied on this continual cycle of root decay and regeneration to maintain both structural integrity and chemical productivity. Roots also moderated the impact of rising and falling water. During floods, submerged root networks slowed water velocity, preventing mats from tearing apart and sediments from washing away. During periods of low water, roots helped retain moisture, stabilized mats, and preserved sediment layers that might otherwise dry and crumble. In every phase of the swamp's hydrological cycles, roots acted as adaptive supports, integrating physical, chemical, and biological processes to maintain ecosystem continuity. The vertical reach of roots was equally important. Some extended deep into dense, nutrient-rich sediments, anchoring the swamp's surface and connecting it to long-term stores of matter. Others spread laterally through shallow layers, intertwining with neighboring plants to form a vast, interconnected web. Together, these root systems integrated floating mats, surface vegetation, and sediment layers into a cohesive unit, creating a three-dimensional matrix of stability and connectivity that guided water flow, nutrient cycling, and mat formation. The hidden strength of roots allowed the swamp to exist as a coherent, self-sustaining ecosystem. Roots reinforced mats, controlled sediment cohesion, shaped microcurrents, and facilitated nutrient distribution, binding the swamp into a dynamic whole that could endure collapse, flood, and decay without losing identity. Long before any predator or larger organism moved through the wetland, roots had already secured its architecture, dictated its chemistry, and maintained the delicate balance between rise and fall, growth and decay, stability and fragility. In the swamp, roots were the silent engineers of survival, the hidden force that made all other life possible. Chemical architects of the wetland. Beneath the surface of the swamp, chemical processes orchestrated the formation, transformation, and perpetuation of its living architecture. Water, sediment, decaying vegetation, and microbial life interacted continuously, producing gradients of oxygen, pH, nutrients, and gases that governed every layer of the ecosystem. These invisible processes were as critical to the swamp structure as roots or mats, shaping where life could persist, how decomposition unfolded, and where nutrients would concentrate. The swamp itself became a chemical workshop, converting raw organic matter into energy, matter, and structure, and ensuring that its productivity and resilience endured through millennia of subtle transformation. Decomposition was the cornerstone of this chemical engineering. As plant matter sank into sediments or remained trapped within mats, microbes consumed complex carbohydrates, lignin, and cellulose, releasing nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon compounds back into the surrounding water and soil. These nutrients circulated through currents, absorbed into sediments, or taken up by roots, forming a continuous cycle that fed new growth. The rate of decomposition was influenced by water saturation, temperature, oxygen availability, and mat density, producing a patchwork of chemical environments across the swamp. In this way, the swamp's chemical architecture was dynamic, constantly responding to environmental conditions while reinforcing its own structure. Anaerobic and aerobic zones coexisted side by side within sediments and mats. Oxygen-deprived areas favoured the production of methane and other gases, while oxygen-rich zones accelerated the breakdown of organic matter into simpler compounds. This juxtaposition created microhabitats with distinct chemical signatures, influencing where plants could root, where mats could stabilize, and where microbial communities thrived. Chemical gradients guided the flow of energy, the retention of nutrients, and the accumulation of sediments, demonstrating that the swamp's vitality depended as much on invisible processes as on its visible structures. Water was the primary medium through which chemical processes acted. Dissolved nutrients, gases, and minerals were transported by currents, infiltrated mats, or percolated into sediments. Subtle changes in flow redirected these chemicals, producing localized zones of enrichment or depletion. Floating mats acted as chemical reservoirs, trapping nutrients while allowing slow exchange with surrounding water. Through these interactions, the swamp maintained heterogeneity, ensuring that no single area became chemically uniform or depleted, and preserving a mosaic of microenvironments that sustained long-term productivity. Sediments themselves acted as chemical processors. Layers rich in organic matter absorbed and retained nutrients, releasing them slowly over time, while mineral-dense layers influenced water pH, ionic composition, and buffering capacity. The chemical interactions between water, sediment, and decaying material created a self-regulating system. Deposition and decay reinforced each other, producing gradients and microzones that structured mats, guided root growth, and controlled gas accumulation. The swamp was a living laboratory where chemistry dictated physical and biological patterns simultaneously. Floating mats played an active role in shaping chemical processes. Their dense networks of roots and decaying matter absorbed dissolved nutrients, filtered sediments, and moderated the release of gases from below. As mats thickened, chemical stratification within them became more pronounced, creating zones of intense microbial activity interspersed with areas of slower decay. These chemical differences influenced buoyancy, structural cohesion, and sediment retention, demonstrating that chemical gradients were not mere byproducts, but central to the swamp's ongoing formation and stability. Chemical cycles were amplified during rise and fall events. Flooding redistributed dissolved compounds and suspended sediments, exposing new surfaces for microbial activity and renewing chemical gradients. Receding water concentrated nutrients in hollows, accelerated oxidation in previously submerged zones, and shifted chemical equilibria across mats and sediments. Each hydrological pulse created a cascade of chemical transformations that reinforced nutrient flow, sediment structure, and microbial diversity. The swamp's chemical architecture and its physical dynamics were inseparable, each shaping the other through cycles of energy and matter. Even gases produced during decomposition contributed structurally. Methane and carbon dioxide rising through sediments and mats affected buoyancy, influencing the stability of floating mats and the movement of organic debris. Localized gas pockets altered chemical concentrations, creating microenvironments where specific microbial communities thrived while others remained dormant. This interplay between chemical release, physical displacement, and biological activity produced a feedback system that reinforced the swamp's resilience, making its architecture adaptive, responsive, and self-sustaining. Ultimately, the chemical processes of the swamp functioned as invisible architects, shaping mats, sediments, currents, and microhabitats with precision and subtlety. Nutrients cycled endlessly, gases moved invisibly, and decomposition transformed matter into structure. Long before any predator, explorer, or external force interacted with the wetland, chemistry had already established its rules, determining where stability could persist, where mats could rise or collapse, and how the swamp could survive the unpredictable forces of water, sediment, and time. Chemistry, like roots and currents, was a foundational pillar of the swamp's enduring identity, orchestrating its hidden symphony of life and decay. The interwoven layers of life. The swamp existed as a tapestry of interwoven layers, where mats, sediments, roots, water, and chemical processes combined to form a three-dimensional ecosystem of extraordinary complexity. No single element operated in isolation. Each depended upon and reinforced the others, creating a dynamic, self-regulating network. Floating mats rested upon sediments enriched by decomposition, while roots penetrated both mats and mud, anchoring them and connecting the chemical, physical, and biological layers. Water moved through this matrix, carrying dissolved nutrients, gases, and fine sediments, distributing life and energy across the swamp. Every process, from the slow decay of a fallen leaf to the subtle flow of microcurrents, contributed to the intricate layering that defined the wetland's identity. Floating mats were both the surface and the medium of integration. Dense networks of roots, decomposing plant matter, and accumulated sediment created platforms capable of supporting new growth while simultaneously redistributing nutrients and gases. Mats linked otherwise isolated zones, allowing energy and matter to circulate efficiently throughout the swamp. Their buoyancy responded to water levels, sediment density, and decomposition, creating a surface that was flexible yet cohesive. This constant adjustment connected the swamp vertically and horizontally, turning a fragmented landscape into a continuous, integrated ecosystem. Sediments served as the swamp's foundational layer, recording both history and function. As water moved across the wetland, sediments carried nutrients and gases to different zones, while decaying plant matter became incorporated into layers that would sustain microbial and plant life for decades. These layers created subtle microtopographies, directing currents, influencing mat formation, and shaping root penetration. Sediments were more than inert matter. They were active participants in nutrient cycling, chemical reactions, and structural reinforcement, connecting water, vegetation, and microbial communities into a living matrix. Roots threaded through this complexity, reinforcing mats, stabilizing sediments, and integrating the swamp's vertical and horizontal layers. Deep roots anchored mats to sediments, while lateral roots connected neighboring plants and mats, distributing stress and maintaining cohesion across unstable surfaces. Roots also facilitated nutrient uptake and chemical exchange, moving compounds from decomposing material in sediments into living vegetation. By linking physical and chemical layers, roots created continuity and resilience, ensuring that the swamp's ecosystem could endure collapse, flood, and decay without losing functional integrity. Water was the fluid link binding all layers of the swamp. Surface currents, subsurface flows, and percolation through sediments distributed nutrients, dissolved gases, and organic matter throughout the ecosystem. Rising and receding water levels activated different layers at different times, allowing chemical gradients to shift, mats to rise or settle, and microbial activity to vary. Water connected the visible and invisible components of the swamp, enabling interactions between mats, roots, sediments, and chemical processes that produced continuous regeneration and adaptation. Chemical processes operated invisibly within this web, reinforcing and mediating the interactions of mats, roots, sediments, and water. Decomposition released nutrients, generated gases, and shaped pH and oxygen gradients, influencing where mats stabilized, where sediments compacted, and where microbial communities thrived. These processes responded to shifts in water, sediment, and vegetation, creating a feedback loop in which chemistry dictated structure and structure dictated chemistry. The swamp's internal organization was guided as much by chemical energy as by physical architecture. The rise and collapse of mats created dynamic interactions between layers. When mats shifted or sank, sediments below were exposed, nutrients were redistributed, and water flow changed locally. Roots adapted to these new conditions, reinforcing unstable zones while allowing the swamp to reorganize. Collapse was not destruction, but reconfiguration. It integrated the movement of water, the deposition of sediment, and the redistribution of nutrients into a coordinated system of renewal. Every collapse, rise, and lateral shift strengthened the interconnectedness of layers, producing an ecosystem resilient to change and capable of self-maintenance. Even minor components contributed to the complexity of these layers. Floating debris, fallen leaves, or small sediment mounds influenced water flow, microbial activity, and chemical gradients. They created microhabitats where localized nutrient concentrations or oxygen levels differed, allowing specialized microbial and plant communities to thrive. The swamp was a living mosaic of interdependent zones, each layer shaped by and shaping the others in ways that amplified diversity, productivity, and resilience. The swamp's interwoven layers formed a fully integrated system where physical structure, water movement, roots, mats, sediments, and chemistry acted in concert. Every element was linked, every process dependent upon the others, producing a three-dimensional ecosystem capable of self-regulation, adaptation, and renewal. Long before any predator navigated its surfaces or exploited its resources, the swamp had already established a hierarchy of interactions, a network of dependencies, and a resilient structure that allowed it to endure cycles of rise, fall, and transformation over millennia. Life, water, and matter flowed through these layers in an endless dance, creating a wetland both fragile and extraordinarily robust. The hidden energy of decomposition. Decomposition was the engine of the swamp, a silent and invisible force that powered chemical, physical, and biological processes alike. Fallen leaves, broken stems, and decaying roots did not simply vanish into the murky water. They were transformed by microbial and fungal communities into energy, nutrients, and gases that circulated through every layer of the ecosystem. Each stage of decay released compounds that fueled plant growth, enriched sediments, and produced chemical gradients, creating pockets of fertility that maintained productivity across the swamp. Decomposition acted not only as a recycler of matter, but as a generator of energy, an essential process that underpinned the entire wetland's resilience and adaptability. The process of decay was spatially heterogeneous. In oxygen-rich zones near the surface, microbes rapidly consumed organic material, breaking it down into nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus compounds available for uptake by plants and algae. In deeper, waterlogged sediments, anaerobic decomposition dominated, producing methane, carbon dioxide, and other gases that gradually rose through mats and water columns. These gaseous outputs influenced buoyancy, the chemical composition of water, and the stability of floating vegetation, showing that decomposition did not merely recycle matter, but actively shaped the swamp's structure and dynamics. Floating mats were both sites and beneficiaries of decomposition. Trapped organic matter within mats decayed slowly, feeding microbial colonies embedded in roots and fibrous material. This slow release of nutrients provided sustained energy to surface vegetation, allowing mats to support heavier plants and denser root networks than the surrounding waterlogged zones. The decomposition within mats also influenced buoyancy and cohesion. As fibers broke down and gases accumulated, mats flexed, shifted, and occasionally collapsed, distributing organic matter into adjacent sediments and restarting the cycle. Mats were living reactors, simultaneously consuming and distributing energy and matter throughout the swamp. sediments beneath the mats absorbed nutrients released during decay, transforming them into reservoirs of fertility that could persist for years. Decomposing matter altered sediment chemistry, changing pH, oxygen concentration, and ionic composition, which in turn affected microbial activity, root growth, and the structural stability of mats above. The interaction between decomposition and sediment created feedback loops. Decay enriched sediments, sediments supported mats and vegetation, and mats trapped more organic material, which would eventually decay again. This self-reinforcing cycle ensured that the swamp's energy and nutrient flows remained continuous and sustainable over time. Decomposition also fueled the movement of chemical gradients and microcurrents. As gases and dissolved nutrients were released, they shifted in response to water flow, sediment compaction, and mat density. Oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus traveled across short and long distances, influencing microbial activity in neighboring zones, encouraging new plant growth, and sustaining diverse microhabitats. The swamp's energy did not remain localized. Decomposition generated flows that connected layers, mats, and sediments into a dynamic network of interaction. Even minor variations in decomposition rates produced cascading effects across the swamp. A slightly accelerated decay in one zone could enrich sediments, encourage root proliferation, and alter mat buoyancy, which in turn redirected water flow and redistributed organic material to other areas. Conversely, slower decomposition created pockets of preserved matter that could serve as energy reserves during periods of low productivity. Decomposition was therefore both localized and systemic, a process whose effects extended far beyond the site of immediate decay, shaping the structure, chemistry, and stability of the wetland on multiple scales. Decomposition interacted with hydrological cycles in profound ways. Flooding accelerated decay in submerged zones by increasing water pressure, dispersing nutrients, and temporarily enhancing oxygen availability in certain layers. Receding water exposed sediments to air, triggering rapid aerobic decomposition and altering chemical equilibria. Each pulse of water became an accelerator or modulator of decay, linking hydrology, energy flow, and chemical cycling into a tightly coordinated sequence of events that reinforced the swamp's adaptive architecture. Roots and decomposition were also inseparable. Roots drew nutrients from decayed matter, while simultaneously stabilizing sediments and mats to allow further organic accumulation. Some roots penetrated decaying layers directly, facilitating localized decomposition while extracting energy for growth. This intimate relationship between living structures and decaying material allowed the swamp to integrate energy release with physical stability, ensuring that decomposition supported both chemical productivity and structural integrity simultaneously. Decomposition was the hidden energy that sustained the swamp, powering nutrient cycles, shaping chemical gradients, stabilizing mats and sediments, and regulating microhabitats. It transformed dead matter into a force that built, reinforced, and renewed the ecosystem continuously. Long before any predator or larger organism entered its domain, decomposition had already defined the swamp's character, orchestrating the invisible flows of energy and matter that enabled resilience, productivity, and longevity. The swamp thrived not despite decay, but because of it, and within that perpetual transformation lay the secret of its enduring vitality.